to segment 3.2. Today in our lecture we'll be looking at some of the requirements for originality, and that in fact is one of the main questions that I asked for the reading on page 132. This was in relation to the FEIS Publications versus Rural Telephone Service Company, and is really kind of a seminal case that helps us understand what exactly is originality and what are the requirements for it. So that's a question that we will be discussing during today's lecture. Let's go ahead and dig into this case a little bit. First off, who is FEIS Publications? And so we have FEIS, and keep in mind FEIS on one hand, Rural Telephone Service on the other. So FEIS here was a publishing company that simply created directories. So, almost similar to Yellow Pages type directories. And FEIS's geographic service area was much larger than Rural's. Rural, on the other hand, was a local telephone company that provided telephone service. And they created directories that was actually part of a state regulation, so they had to create these directories, and then they would distribute this free of charge within their service area. Now they would generate money off of the advertisements that were placed within this directory that they were required to in fact create. Rural refused, so FEIS comes to Rural and says, hey, you already have a directory there, we would like to use it and include it within our larger geographic directory, and can we do so? And Rural says no. So what does FEIS do? FEIS goes behind their back, they extract the listings from Rural, and then they include those same listings in the directory. And you may wonder, well, how do they know that it was actually being sourced from Rural Telephone Service? And it's actually a very easy answer, because mistakes that are in one publication often end up in the other, and that is the case here as well. So Rural, in response, goes ahead and they sue FEIS for copyright infringement. Now the issue here fundamentally comes down to, is publicly accessible information in a telephone directory entitled to copyright? So this is, again, information that anybody can access. It's been compiled based off of state regulation. Now the conclusion here, let's talk first about the conclusion, and then we'll take some steps back as to how it is the court arrived at this conclusion. But the conclusion was simply the Rural's white pages, try saying that 10 times fast, are not entitled to copyright protection. Therefore, the use of this information and directory by FEIS does not constitute copyright infringement. Now, when the court actually looked at this, they gave some understanding, or at least some indication, as to what is the basis for originality. And it's this basis of originality that helps us understand a little bit as to how it is that the court came to this conclusion, that namely, Rural's material does not, or they are not entitled to copyright infringement. So it comes down to two different requirements for originality. And the first is, the work must be independently created by the author. And this is different than, for example, as opposed to merely copying from other existing works. So if you're merely just copying it over, that probably would not satisfy. There needs to be some independent creation by the author to some degree. And the second part is, the work must possess, quote, a minimal degree of creativity. Now, with respect to the first requirement there, that there must be some independent creation by an author, that's usually pretty easy to satisfy. Either there is some independent creation or there is not. And so there's not too much of a subjective scale there. On the other hand, whether or not there is some minimal degree of creativity, you may be thinking in your mind, well, that's an extremely subjective analysis. What I see as beautiful may differ from what you see as beautiful. And that's very true. But keep in mind here that the minimal degree of creativity is almost on or off type switch. Either there is some minimal degree of creativity or there isn't. And you can almost think of this as very similar to our 101 type discussion that we had in relation to patents, because the threshold for 101, is there some utility for the invention, is very, very low. In other words, if it's something other than flying at the speed of light for 1,000,000 years or perpetual motion, so there's usually exclusions as to what is not allowed for 101. But that being said, the threshold for does it have some useful function can easily be satisfied, and that's almost similar to what it is that we have here. The minimal degree of creativity is a very low threshold. If there is arguably any amount of creativity, then they may be able to satisfy the second prong for originality. Now, the influence of the holding here, let's take a little bit out, a little look at that. The work that lacks originality cannot be protected by copyright. And that would make sense. If we went back to section 102A that we were discussing before, one of the primary requirements in order to get copyright protection is that it be original. And these requirements of originality, if they're not satisfied, it would fail one of the requirements for copyright protection. So a work that lacks originality is not protected by copyright, and creative additions to pre-existing materials for copyright. So what does that mean? It means that additionally, if there's any creative additions to pre-existing that lacks originality is not protected by creative additions. So for purposes of our discussion again, let's say that there's a list of white pages and there's no amount of originality associated with that. If somebody comes and then takes the white pages and then applies some degree of creativity to it, then in fact that original list is not entitled to copyright protection later on as well. And if there isn't copyright associated with the original work, you can't obviously then be suing for copyright infringement. Now, if we look at white pages, lists of customers, that's one aspect. But if you compare that, for example, with a poorly written song or artwork in bad taste, things of that nature. So the creative additions to that which is already existing, those creative additions in fact may be eligible for copyright protection despite the fact that some of the material that they are using is not entitled to copyright protection. Now, non-original elements of a work are not protected. So what does this mean? A book may be copyrighted, but the facts, figures, elements that are not created by the author may be freely copied. So there are some textbooks that I've written in the past. Some of those textbooks, in fact, were in part created by others that assisted in writing it. And those that assisted in writing would retain a copyright over the express contribution that they had to the book. So what do we need? We have discussed a little bit as far as the requirements for originality and exactly what is needed. There needs to be, again, some independent creation and minimal degree of creativity. But the independent creation, what does this actually mean? It means that it requires that the maker, that the creator be a maker, not simply one who discovers a fact. And so if you simply discover a fact that is not sufficient to actually satisfy this requirement of independent creation, additionally, as I indicated before, the minimal amount of creativity can easily be satisfied in that it is a very low standard that must be satisfied in order for that requirement to be fine. Now, and I think that is probably the main takeaway that I want you to come away with for originality, that there needs to be some independent creation and that there needs to be some exhibit of minimal degree of creativity. Now, there was actually an additional case actually around this time frame. Both of these were around 1991. And the question is, can white pages therefore ever be copyrightable? Because if, as we saw here, if Ruhl is putting together these white pages, Feist comes along, takes it, and includes it in it, the reality is that those white pages within the Feist publication would not be entitled to copyright protection. But FICE protection as a whole would be entitled to copyright protection, with exclusions of any material that is not entitled to copyright protection would not be protected. Here, in this case, Key Publications versus Chinatown, the question was very much whether or not White Pages would ever be entitled to copyright protection. And the conclusion was yes, White Pages would be entitled to copyright protection. And the question is, well, when? And here, in this particular case, what we had going on was that the compiler selected New York City businesses of interest based off of, for example, Chinese Americans. So there was some grouping together based off of the data and the information that was being received. And then the publisher here then arranged them using categories of interest to that particular community. If we go back to the requirements of originality, was there some independent creation? Yes. And the independent creation would be just based off of the fact that all this data was being assembled and compiled and put together. The second was there some degree of creativity? And in this case, even grouping the data together into these other subgroups was sufficient to, in fact, satisfy that second requirement, namely some minimal degree of creativity.